Good evening. Bonsoir à tous. Merci d'être venus ce soir. Good evening. My name is Isabelle Bageux, and I'm the Dean of the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. I'm really delighted to welcome you on this beautiful day in Montreal to this very special event hosted by the Desautels Institute for Integrated Management. I want to extend some very warm welcome to our speakers, both Eric Labaye and Brian Rubineau, our professors, our alumni, our students, and of course, all of our friends of Desautels, McGill, and esteemed guests. Thank you for joining us for the 8th Integrated Management Symposium, entitled tonight, The Workforce is Transitioning and Everything Matters. It is thanks to the generosity of Marcel Desautels, our alumni and friends, that we're able to bring together thought leaders and members of our community to discuss and reflect on important management challenges. This evening, we will address the hot topic of automation technology. The rise of these technologies is expected to deliver great benefits to productivity, economic growth, and safety over the next decade. At the same time, they will likely disrupt the global workforce. Jobs, as we know today, will be lost, changed, or radically different. Tonight, our speakers will explore how we can embrace the advancement of artificial intelligence and robotics while taking into consideration those whose jobs will be affected. These groups include women, minorities, people with disabilities, immigrants, and people with lower educational levels. Who better to provide insight on this topic than Eric Labaye, senior partner of McKinsey Company. Based in Paris, my hometown, Eric works extensively for clients globally in the telecom, media, high-tech, energy, and industrial sectors, as well as for public and health institutions. He's a member of the Council of the McKinsey Global Institute, of which he was chairman from 2010 to 2016, and of the Global Client Council. In addition to his client work, Eric has conducted major research projects with the McKinsey Global Institute in the fields of economic development, productivity, and digital transformation. He initiated and co-led McKinsey's Women Matter research program, which aims to promote gender diversity at the senior management level of large organizations. To recognize his efforts, he has received the Lower Bryan Award given by McKinsey female directors to those furthering the professional development of women in the firm. Eric is a graduate of École Polytechnique and Télécom Paris Tech and holds an MBA from INSEAD. It's okay, Eric. We are grateful for him for taking the time to be with us tonight. We're equally excited to hear from Brian Rubineau, Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Desautels Faculty of Management. Brian's research investigates how informal social dynamics contribute to inequalities in occupations and labor markets. He's involved in multiple research collaborations with firms in the finance, investment, and pharmaceutical industries. A recent recipient of the Desautels Faculty Scholar Award, his work has been published in top journals such as Management Science, Organization Science, and the American Sociological Review. Brian holds a PhD in management from MIT and a Master of Science from Harvard University. Thank you, Brian, for facilitating tonight's discussion. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our two speakers to the stage.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And thank you, Eric, for making the trek and making it here safely. So we're a little bit, we're glad that you arrived yesterday, I have to say that. So the topic for our discussion today is the transitioning workforce. And we're coming to a time, and we're actually in the midst of a time, of major transitions in the workforce. And I would like to hear your perspective on the kinds of transitions that you're seeing from the perspective of McKinsey, and what are the transitions and who's being affected by them?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you also, Isabel, for the nice introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. Great to be, in fact, here to discuss where the workforce is going. I would start by maybe a couple of comments. The first one is, when you think about the last 15 years, there's been two major forces in the world. One is obviously technology, and we're going to talk a lot about technology today, with a lot of evolution on many dimensions of technology. The second also is globalization. If you go back to 1990, there was 1 billion consumer and workers, I would say, in the world. Today we have 3 billion and on the way to 4 or 5. And somehow the transition we are seeing is a combination of these two forces. There is both the technological transformation, but also the globalization that has changed a lot of the competitive dynamics in terms of where workers are, because consumers are also workers, and therefore competition has been going on between companies on a more global basis. And the combination of these two makes that today workforce is transitioning, both because automation is coming, digitization is coming, which are two forces I'm sure we'll explore a bit more during the afternoon. But at the same time also there is intense global competition, which is displacing jobs at the same time. So the combination of these two. And if we just get one number in mind, when you think about the first industrial revolution, it took 15 years to double 150 years to double the GDP of 10 million people in Britain. It has taken, 15 years only to double for 3 billion people over the past 15 years, which means that the intensity of the transformation is something like 3,000 more important now than it was at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And you think about the difficulty or the fact it was a very hard transition, you can see today 3,000 more intensity is pretty important. And maybe to illustrate, with one element, and I would use a few charts, not a lot, but a few, just to make maybe a few numbers visible. The left side here is, the transition of the sectors that I'm sure all of us have in mind in terms of, obviously, the agricultural transformation of the end of the 19th century, where some sectors at 60% went down to 5 or 10% over 60 years. And when we have that in mind, I think what is happening today, to your question, Brian, is that that took maybe 60 or 70 years to happen, I think is going to happen in a shorter amount of time, which is we see a speed where jobs are changing, occupation are changing, tasks are changing, the link between the man and the machine is changing. That is going to have similar impact, but in a shorter time frame. And the key questions around that, obviously, is are we going to have enough jobs for everyone? That's somehow one of the discussion is, or are jobs going to disappear, and therefore, are just people going to be unemployed? And here on the right side, I would put for today's discussion the view that so far, when you look at history, technological changes have always produced more jobs. And I'm sure we'll come back to that. The right side is the impact of personal computers from 1980 to today, where it has created more than 15 million jobs net. It has destroyed 3 or 4 million, but it has created almost 20. And here, obviously, to think about that, it has destroyed direct jobs, assistant, clerks, etc. But it has far more created jobs of people leveraging the personal computer. Think about even financial analysts. Without a PC, you would not have hundreds of thousands of jobs around that. So we'll come back on this, but for me, the two elements is the speed and magnitude. Magnitude may be similar to the past, but the speed likely higher. And the second is what is the right equilibrium. But for that, we can see jobs or activities disappearing. But obviously, at which speed are we going to create these jobs? And I'm sure we'll come back on that, because that's some of this supply and demand question is a key question.
So just to be clear, right, the transition that you're seeing now, you're saying, well, we're certainly in the midst of a transition, but the transition that you're seeing now is many times greater than the transition we experienced in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, from a magnitude standpoint. Yeah.
And the automation and digitization that we're experiencing, would you say it's having a bigger impact now than the introduction of the computer to the workplace, which was happening maybe 30, 40 years ago?
Two elements on that. And I think the answer is there are two things. First, there are many technologies happening at the same time. And I'm going to give you some examples on that. And the second is there is a combination of technology. For me, that's the two elements that are very particular to today. So let me give you some examples. Here is somehow we looked at many technologies, and here are some of the, let's say, the 10 to 12 technologies with a huge impact on the economy. And roughly these technologies impact half of the world GDP today. 4 buckets of technologies that I'm sure will not surprise anyone. One is around the digitization that you mentioned, which is around cloud, around mobile, around Internet of Things, and around automation and AI. One around automatization, the robot, the autonomous vehicle. One around genomics and materials, what is really the smallest part of nature. And then one around the revolution on energy. And obviously, you can add a few other elements, a few other technologies, but here are some of these technologies. And when you think about the impact, here is the potential impact of disruption on the global world. And when you think about the total GDP of the world, it's $70–80 billion. And what is on this chart is roughly 35. Roughly half of the GDP of the world is at stake. So when I say at stake, it means can disappear, can be created, can be transformed. And the first two you will see are IoT and mobile. I would say mobile is obvious because the customer relation, every customer relation is impacted by mobile. I think all of us see it every day. And whatever we do is impacted. So impacting means something we're maybe doing through the PC or in person. Now we do it with the mobile. IoT is going to impact a lot of processes because once you start putting sensors, you do things differently, be in manufacturing, in city management, in home, in healthcare, and so on. So to your question, I think these technologies today roughly are changing half of the world or can change half of the world. And here we didn't think about 2050 when we did these projections. We are thinking about 10, 15 years down the road. We see this is a potential at stake, which also is another way to look at what I was mentioning, which is the intensity and the magnitude of the change is huge because a lot of the steps of the value chains are impacted. And last but not least, many of the transformation we see are a combination of these technologies, which is going to be a combination of automation plus IoT plus artificial intelligence plus maybe genomics on healthcare. So the combinational effect makes it, in fact, more impactful.
And if we're thinking about the comparison again with the Industrial Revolution, the graph that you showed earlier, right? We know that progress takes place in an uneven manner, right? So there was this huge transition from agricultural to mechanical, but yet there are many parts of the world that are still primarily agricultural, right? So it stands to reason that the rollout that we're seeing from the current transition is likely to be similarly uneven.
Yes.
Do we have a sense of what sectors, what portions of the world geographically, what sectors, what industries are going to be more or less affected by these transitions?
Yes. So I think what could be interesting is to go to some details in terms of what are the activities that are at stake, and then we can reaggregate. And let me start with that. One of the piece of analysis we did, because we talk about jobs, but to talk about activities. activities, and we looked at 2,000 discrete activities that you can see on this, and we put them into different groups in terms of, is it management, is it expertise, is it collecting data, is it processing data, is it predictable physical activity? And as you would think intuitively, the more you go to the right of the chart, the more you can automate this type of activities. Processing data. This can be automated with software, with artificial intelligence. Predictable activity can put a robot. And in average, 50% of these 2,000 activities can be automated. So 50% today, with today's technology, could be automated. But obviously, it's going to depend in terms of the mix of activities you have. As I said, left a bit less, or right a bit more. But the interesting point is obviously by jobs, it doesn't mean that 50% of the jobs are going to be automated, because every job has a mix of these activities. Some jobs are going to be a lot of 100% physical. Somebody on assembly line, it's 100% physical and predictable. Somebody who is a nurse, it's going to be, some of it can be automated, but some of it cannot. And so what we see here is that you have very few jobs that can be fully automated. It's only maybe less than 5%. Number to have in mind is roughly 60% of the jobs have at least 30% of their activities. And in fact, few jobs, in fact, CEOs, you can figure out that 20% of the activity of a CEO can be automated. I don't know for a university professor, but some of it too. But obviously, a university professor role or a CEO role is not going to disappear. It's going to change. The learning here, or at least the implication we draw from that, is to say that every job is impacted. So our first way to answer your question, Ryan, is to say every job is going to be reconfigured. Some more than others, but it's going to be reconfigured and evolved. And therefore, from that standpoint, then maybe the other point is to your question. It depends. The degree of automation in countries or in sectors is going mainly to depend on the mix of jobs you have. But the second also is going to depend on the environment. If you are in a developed country, you have always this trade-off between salary and capital. It's going to be a different trade-off if you are in a developing country. There's also some societal element. Do people accept interface with machines, or they don't accept interface with machines? All the question about ethical of artificial intelligence is an issue. So you have many factors that are going to have impact, but clearly more jobs will be automated or activities in developed countries than in developing countries.
And when you talk about the transitioning of jobs, so the CEO, right, that can be 20% of the activities related to CEO activities can be automated. That can be freeing up CEO time to do other things, but potentially transformations will be even more drastic, right? Destroying some jobs, creating other support jobs. So do we see these percentages that you're presenting up here on this graph in terms of the activities that are being changed by jobs? The amount of time that's being freed, or the potential for new job creation and new support roles that are being created?
So on this one, in fact, we have tried to understand, as I mentioned before, the element of dynamics, destruction and creation, because this question has been on the table, saying, is it just are we going to see jobs disappear? And right now, at least our median scenarios see an equilibrium between the destruction and the creation. Let me just maybe show that on this page. On the left side, it's a scenario, if you think about by countries, what I was mentioning before, in terms of job destruction, or let's say task automation over the next 15 years, between now and 2030. And what you see that in average, I think a median scenario is a 15% of these activities will disappear. As you see, there is a difference between developed and developing. In India, it's going to be lower. In Germany or the US, it's going to be higher. So developed countries are going to be between 20 and 30%. But at the same time, it's interesting to look at, what are the sources of job creation? And there are sources of job creation. The first element is naturally that there are rising incomes. And when you have rising incomes, productivity gains and others, you create jobs to support this income. Second, aging population. In particular, in some of the developed countries, you have aging population, it requires jobs. Technology itself is going to create jobs to do all this software, robots, autonomous vehicle, etc. Infrastructure, also to support the development. We know that in the world, infrastructure has been underinvested. Transformation of the energy, renewable energy is another one. In some of the developing countries, marketization of work that was done at home that is becoming into the market. So when you add all these forces, basically you find in a median scenario enough jobs to counterbalance, I would say, the activities that are disappearing. One number I would also like to mention is there are studies looking, I was mentioning the computer before, the last 30 years, personal computer impact. When you look at 30 years back, roughly 0.5% a year of the job creation have never been predicted, meaning there are 0.5% of the jobs every year that are created that nobody has thought about. Go back to 1980, who would have mentioned, webmaster, scrum master, et cetera, et cetera. All the role now we have in any, company, marketing agency, and so on. In 1980, nobody would think about that. Now they are the jobs. So they couldn't be in the forecast in 1980. They are real today. So one element to have in mind also is to ensure there is enough, I would say, a vibrant economy to create this job, but roughly 0.5% every year of jobs created that are not right now in our models somewhere. So we put it as the unknown, saying likely there would be that, because they would happen thanks to the creativity of human beings.
So then when we have these projections going forward, right, and there's a certain amount of just unknown creation that's going to happen, but we're also in a unique time where we have the capability of learning from our history, right? We're seeing the parallels with what happened with the Industrial Revolution, with the computer revolution, with the personal computer revolution. And we know at these times of transition, it's also a time of opportunity. Is there a way that we can, do you see ways where we can take advantage of the knowledge that we are at the beginning of a major transition of how work is organized and how work in society is organized, and seize that opportunity to try to help make that transition more smooth, more equitable, or at least guide it in a particular way so that it's, when we're having this destruction, it may not disproportionately fall on certain populations more heavily than others.
So I would say four elements on this. At least we have been working also with some of the governments to think about, how can the public policies or the public sector governance impact that. The first one I would have is ensuring the creation of the new jobs, which is not always a priority, and very often it's linked to regulation. How do you get the right regulation to let the new jobs happen? And very simple. Even when I say new jobs, I can talk about Uber drivers or VTC driver in Paris. We had 20,000 taxi drivers for 80 years. Regulation was forbidding competition. You change regulation, you get 20,000 jobs created. So for me, it's as simple. I would say it's so thinking about the regulation to let the new jobs be created. And this is a very difficult discussion sometimes, or decision, because you are obviously creating competition for in some sectors. You may have some questions, for example, about open data today. Open data is a big force toward job creation. But open data, there are some ethical questions. What kind of data do you open? Is it just system data? Is it personal data? But still, for me, a big element of government is regulation to let the new sectors flourish. The second element is labor market flexibility. How do you get the mobility to be very strong? Because here we are talking about people moving from a function sector geography likely to a new function sector geography. So labor market has to be very flexible to allow that. And linked to this, the question of how do you get a safety net or the social security support. Right now, a lot of the social security in most of the countries is linked to your job, to the fact you are salaried or you are independent, but you are somewhere linked to your job. What we see today is in a world very mobile, very flexible, it will be important to move that to a social security linked to the person, not to the job itself. But over your life, you have a safety net, which is linked to that. And the last one, which is not the least, obviously, is a training. Because we are talking about a major retraining of people to move from sectors, functions to others, to learn how to work with machines, not only by themselves and so on. And so this for me would be the 4 elements, learning from the past, learning from transitions, and obviously the question is how do you get the right mix, speed, intensity of these actions to get going in a community. And so it can be obviously at the level of a state. I think a lot of that also can be at the level of a community in a region, because a lot of our experience, for example, on retraining, is very often it's in a specific area. Obviously, you have global skill pool, but very often it's how do you get everyone around the table to help retrain in a specific either city or small region.
So these either community level or actually federal, national level changes on changing regulation policies, changing the nature of the social safety net, for example, moving it from jobs to people, right? These are big, difficult changes, certainly even more difficult potentially in the more developed countries. Do you see that there's an opportunity for developing countries that are in the process of creating their institutions to potentially lay the foundation to take advantage of this transition so that we might actually see developing countries leapfrogging some of the more developed countries based on those investments?
I think it's, I would say the answer is yes. Obviously, it's going to depend on the starting point. You could say, China somehow on digital is far ahead, at least from a usage standpoint, than some other countries. Not yet on the social protection side. But the point is that the impact of automation is going to be different, as I mentioned, in developed versus developing. So it's why the answer I would say is yes directionally. The more they can leapfrog to create the status of tomorrow, obviously the better. But at the same time, they have also some of the skills of today, where they still have a lot of population to train on the skills of today, obviously on the skills of tomorrow. But the challenge is a bit different. So the mix of action, I think, has to be balanced between the two. But for example, the social safety net you mentioned, definitely it would be ridiculous to put the one of yesterday versus the one of tomorrow. So that's the one where I would put the most emphasis on the leapfrogging.
And so that's within countries. Do you see also, I guess, within industries, functional areas of organizations, different opportunities to advance or different needs to adapt to this transition?
Yes, I think some of the sectors are not at the same stage, and here I can show you one element. Here is a colorful chart, but very simple. Green is highly digitized, red is very little digitized. And here you see the different sectors. From the top, the ICT sector, professional sectors, after the capital-intensive sectors, down to very local sectors like agriculture, hotels, travel, and so on. And the 3 axes are just the degree of digitization. Are the assets digitized? Is the usage digitized? And is the labor digitized? And as you can see here, obviously the status of digitization is not the same today, so the dynamic is not the same. Some of them are at a higher speed on this track than some others. However, when you look at the opportunities, you can see opportunities across the different sectors, from the ICT sector down to, let's say, travel or agriculture. Artificial intelligence is, for example, is going to have a huge impact both on travel, how to get, they propose to a consumer, the next travel to make, or in agriculture to increase the yields. So here is the current status. but the opportunities somehow are going to be across the board over time, but with a challenge to capture them, because as we see, some sectors are starting from far, some others are closer to it. So dynamic across, for the future, pretty intense. But also when you think about the gap to close, is going to be obviously bigger at the one at the bottom than the one at the top that have already started to accelerate, which means also that in terms of the skills, there is going to be a huge, I would say, a battle for skills, because everyone somehow has a challenge, but some of them are starting from a better position today than some others.
And so when we're talking about getting appropriately skilled in developing the training and education systems, right? This is one of the areas where this overlaps with my research. I've been looking at the underrepresentation of women in engineering fields, for example, and if we look at the top of this graph, we see tech-heavy and also finance, and Desautels has a Women in Finance initiative as well, that looking at trying to make sure that we can integrate women into roles, occupations, and activities involving skill sets where women are traditionally underrepresented. So it seems like, once we have this kind of ordering, we can see that different professions and different groups of people based on their training might be differently able to succeed or be more threatened by this transition. We also, you were mentioning about the social safety net. And we know that, for example, if the social safety net is an important part of making the transition smooth, then the current social safety net, which is more associated with jobs, we know that people who are more easily able to access jobs that are associated with stronger benefits and stronger supports will be better able to make this transition, will be in a better position, while the safety net's associated with jobs, and the people who tend to have difficulty getting those kind of jobs, which tend to be more vulnerable populations in terms of socioeconomic status, they will be more vulnerable through this transition. So what do you see about, is this transition an opportunity for all, a situation where we might likely see vulnerable populations disproportionately challenged by the transition, and what kind of dimensions do you see as being important?
Yeah, I would first make one remark, just to keep in mind, and not to avoid the question, but if we take a global perspective, when I'm thinking about when I was mentioning the global transition of the past 15 years, we have taken 3 billion of people out of poverty in 15 years. So just at the global basis, I think it's always important to remind that. We had 1.2 billion, now we are close to 4 billion. So on a global basis, the transition of the past 15 years has at least had this impact, which I think is already a major progress for humanity. At the same time, back to your question, in some of the developed countries, we have seen a bigger divide between skills, no skills, and people in some region versus some others. So it's why it's back to technology and globalization impacting differently the different population around the world. So I wanted just we keep that in mind. Now on the developed country and your question, for me one of the key elements is going to be around the training, the training and the jobs. We did some work 2 years ago on inequality. Let me step back a minute. On inequality in 6 countries over the past 10 years. And the way we looked at it was we compared 95-2005 to 2005-2015 in terms of the progress of households' revenues. And the countries were US, Netherlands, Sweden, France, UK, and Italy. And between 95 and 2005, you had almost 90% of the households had a progression in their revenue. When you go to 2005, 2015, 75 didn't see a progress in the revenue. After government redistribution, I think it was around 30 to 40. But the market mechanism didn't produce this, except in one country, which was Sweden. In Sweden, everybody benefited in the last 10 years of progress. Every household has benefited from that. And interestingly, because for me, the country, at least Sweden, has started reforms of its labor market, of its pension fund, of its innovation approaches, of its safety nets in the 94 timeframe. So when they were in 2005, they had a labor market, a training market or a training ability, the fact they were following everyone, the labor market is really following everyone, retraining, putting them into jobs, etc. And so I take that as an example that somehow it can work. It's not that everywhere it doesn't work. Yeah, in many places it doesn't work. In some places it works. Again, it may not be perfect, but over 10 years, everybody has been seeing, every household has seen the revenue increases. Their unemployment rate is pretty low. Innovation is pretty good. So they worked on the four things I mentioned. Somehow is a way, maybe back to the four elements I mentioned. Some countries that are able to in an harmonic way, work on these four dimensions of creating the jobs, the safety nets, the training, and the labor market mobility, and following everyone one by one, the segment of one, if I may say. If you are able to do that, then you can help the vulnerable to stay or to come back into the market. But for that, obviously, it's coordination, everyone, and a lot of management attention, if I may say.
So Sweden's an important test case or an important example of a country that's been doing the infrastructure investments that you identified as being important for the transition. But one of the additional benefits of that is that by making those investments in the social policy levers, then as the transition is taking place, we see less of the gap that might be growing compared to the countries that haven't been making that investment, right? Because
exactly.
So the transition itself is this opportunity to, creates the occasion where the gaps might be growing or they might be shrinking, but if we want to shrink the gaps, we have to make these public investments in policy, regulation, education, and social safety net.
Yeah. And if so, fully support that. And if I may, also because you may say, oh, it's only at the government level, I want to come back to a point I made earlier, which is it's also at the local level that things can happen also well. And here, there is one initiative we have taken at McKinsey 4 or 5 years ago, which is called Generation, which is addressing the youth unemployment. And we have taken 5 countries, or in 5 countries, 5 local communities around the US, around India, Kenya, Spain. And the goal is how to put youth in 3 months back in the marketplace, back in employment. Young people at 18 who have dropped out of high school and getting them into the job market, into a job. So it's by 100 by 100, and right now we have done a few thousands of that over 3-4 years. And here the key is in fact to get everyone to discuss what is required. So you put around the table the employer, the government or the region, the education institution, and you say, okay, guys, what is required right now at time T in the job market? Is it customer care? Is it sales force? Is it data analytics? Is it nurses? Or what is it? And then based on that, you develop the curriculum, and then you get the youth through it. And in 3 months, right now we have an 85% rate of placement rate, and after a year, 75% retention. And as you can see, in 5 or 6 different countries that are very, very different. So I'm taking that also as saying, look, yes, governments have to put the environment right along the 4 dimensions we discussed, but also in the local communities, getting everyone to work together, supply and demand, plus obviously excellence in execution, can also have a huge impact on putting vulnerable people or youth who have not been well trained back into the market. So for me, it's a sum of all these dimensions that can have a strong impact.
Can we go even smaller? So we've been talking about national investment, and now we can talk about community investment. But what about the managers, right? Or what about the leaders, the CEOs that are only, that the other 80% of the CEO role that we still can't automate just yet? So, right, organizational leaders are often in a context where there's huge external pressures to adopt AI, to adopt deep learning, to adopt automation and digitization. How can they do that in a way that's both going to benefit the organization, right, and help be part of this community effort that you're saying, where everybody has to participate in making it better?
I think obviously they are part of a community, so it's also their responsibility to move forward. And here I would have a simple statement: is being ahead. Being ahead, meaning being bold and embracing the digital transformation. Just one data point: we have looked at many companies, digitizing. What I showed you, I think that's somewhere. Yeah, we did that on. It's a graph on 30 or 40 companies. But when we look at the digital quotient, it's a way of identifying how digital is a company. And in an industry, here it's across a few industries, you see a huge gap in companies being digital in terms of the way they operate digitally. It's back to the assets, labor I was mentioning before. It's 1 to 8 in the same industry. And interestingly enough, the one on the right side, the most digital companies, they have 3 characteristics. They grow twice as fast as their competitors on the left. They have a total return to shareholder 3 times higher. They have higher productivity. And they have also wage increase twice as the one on the left side. So
everybody wants to be those companies.
Yeah. So now so you could say obvious. Yeah, obvious. Not always obvious, but at least. So when you are in an industry, how can you lead the digital way? And again, it doesn't mean just doing digital for digital, but how can you be in the leading position of the digitization of your industry? Because on the right side, it's not only .com. You could say, oh, okay, it's Google, it's Facebook. No. Here you have brick and mortar company on the right side of this chart that are just at the head of their digitalization of their industry. And so what do these companies do? Somehow it's back to your question. And what do? They start from the customers first. They think about how do I satisfy the customers with digital, which is a good way to define what is right in digital. It's not just doing digital for digital, it's to customer experience, customer segmentation, etc. How do I do that? So starting from the customer. Second, they do test and learn. So it's not just big plan of let's do a 5-year digital plan. It's I test and learn and then I scale up. So it's this approach which in digital you can take it bit by bit and then aggregate it and get something going. Very often they do a 2-speed IT, which is they do on the side to be quick. They implement an agile organization. So a lot of discussion, a lot of how do I get most of the CEOs how do I get an organization which is more agile than today? So how do I get more fluidity? How do I reorganize for that? How do I empower the operational people? And then how do I get also digital native talents? Because you need always to have a mix. You can't just retrain your people. You have also to get some digital native. And so based on that, then when you have that, then you are at the forefront. But part of it is obviously going to train, back to your question, to train people inside, to get digital native, to try to get basically your company as a leader. And from that standpoint, the most important is always, I would go back to customers, which is usually drive that from the customer and then change everything and adapt behind.
So I'm going back to the idea that there's uneven progress on these kind of efforts. So we have an example in Canada that's been in the news a lot, again, talking about governments, but this time not government as representative of the nation, but government as a particular type of organization with a particular type of client, right? So the Canadian government has done this transformation in its pay system, the Phoenix system, right? Working with a well-respected tech company and saying, we want to, advance, automate, digitize to the extent possible, and it's been a colossal disaster. I guess the estimates of both like implementing it in terms of time and expense, and then the time and expense to unimplement it and substitute something else has been huge. I understand there's kind of been a similar experience with the French military and these kind of ERP transformations. So what do you think we did wrong in terms of what you were just saying and what organizations need to do? And is this kind of uneven progress something that we can learn from, right? Because organizations often try to say, okay, well, we're going to embrace this digital frontier. We want to make this transformation. We want to embrace it. We want to lead, be ahead. Let's try to get there. And in this, I don't know, in the speed or desire to get ahead, make all these colossal stumbling mistakes.
So on this one, I would have two remarks. The first one, as I mentioned, I think a lot of what I've seen in digital is test and learn. So you have less and less companies that just say, similar to the ERP implementation. When you think digital, you think about, how can I price better here? How can I optimize my production line here? How can I propose to my client, a customer, the next product to buy? So you have plenty of areas where you can identify an impact of digital. And so test and learn from there. So maybe, and again, I don't know exactly the case you mentioned. I could see in the papers. As I mentioned, we have also in the papers a similar French case of these big transformations that are a bit like ghost plans. It's like a huge thing for 4 years. And I think on this one, is it the wrong or right approach? I don't know. More and more, you don't have this type of programs. As I mentioned, more and more, it's bit by bit, and then you get assembled. But in the case of large programs, I don't know. Usually there are 2 or 3 reasons why it could fail. One is it's not managed at the right level, so it's not the right leadership that is managing it. So therefore, people cannot drive all the right resources. Second, you don't have the right skills on it. You don't have enough of the people to do it. Third, there is no operating rigor to drive the program. And fourth, there is not this release mentality of every 3 months you release something, you test, and then you continue. It's like, everything is done after 3 years and nothing in between. Again, here I don't know the case, but what I see, at least what I would draw is more and more bit-sized type of approaches is a way to go digital. Obviously, you need to have an architecture, but it's not these big programs, less and less.
So if you have a very large organization, just because you're large and you want to create a change doesn't mean you try to change all the organization at once. You were saying test and learn and bit by bit, so you create pilot programs or test beds in different parts and then try to test and learn from those to expand to the rest of the organization more organically?
Yeah, I was mentioning Agile organization. That's I'm sure you see that also in your organization. More and more, the topic is, if you look at the past 15 years, organizations have been highly transversally processed. Purchasing organization across, finance organization across. So a lot of the organizations now are really matrixed. And a lot of the CEOs are just saying, my organization doesn't move because I need to be reactive at the customer level, what I mentioned before, and I need to get more energy, more agility. And how do you get an organization more agile? Right now, it's by re-empowering the front line. And getting rid of a few of, I would say, the corporate levels. So we see a lot of corporation reducing the number of levels of management, empowering, putting more people in front of the customers or in the operations, in their businesses, changing the way to work, which is this approach of, let's get something every week or every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. So it's both a structure, a process, because also, the customers are evolving very rapidly. So it's moving from I predict everything that is going to be done to the field is really in charge. And this is what digital helps. Because one thing that the CEO has, thanks to digital, he has information every day on what's going on in his organization. Before he didn't. Before he wanted to control because he didn't have information. Now with digital, you almost have in real time what is happening in your organization. Therefore, you can trust more your operational leaders because you have the feedback loop.
And yet, some of the most digital companies, right, are having huge and well-publicized and difficulties with issues of diversity, particularly around gender. One of the things that Dean Baje mentioned was that you were instrumental in creating the Women Matters research project at McKinsey in 2007. I know that's been ongoing since then. What are some of the lessons you have or the overlaps between automation and digitization and the lessons from the Women Matter research project?
So first, I would like to mention that Sandrine de Villard is here, who is another of the authors. And she took the lead also in 2007 when we launched it together. So I wanted to salute her as she's in the room, and has been for the past 10 years or so working on that. Now, two elements. So I can answer your question in two parts. Maybe first, the learnings of Women Matter is obviously the first learning is diversity in management get better performance of organizations. That's, it's intuitive. I think all of us have this aspiration, but we have, let's say, demonstrated over time that when you have diverse management, gender-wise, you get better organizational performance. Obviously, also financial performance, but more importantly, better organization performance. So that's the point one. The point two is that the issue, obviously, we talk a lot about, women in executive committees, but in fact, it starts from day one, which is you don't have one glass ceiling, you have multiple ceilings. It's almost the entire pipeline. Women don't progress in the organizations. And for that, two reasons. One is the operating model is not, I would say, adapted to the double burden fulfilled by women. And the second is our bias in the organization in terms of how decisions are made. So it's an organization made by men for men, not for women. And so the learnings we have taken from that in terms of how to make change happen, one is you need to get the CEO, at least the top leadership, to be really putting that as a priority. Otherwise, nothing changes. Because we studied also change. I'm not going to detail the learnings from that, but CEO matters. Two, getting operational leaders accountable for progress is critical, which is it can't just be the CEO saying something. It's really in the trenches. People have to say, yeah, I'm going to provide equal opportunity, promote equally people, men and women, provided they are, as good, which, by the way, they are when they enter, so there is no reason it shouldn't continue. So accountability, number two. Number three is creating an infrastructure, enabling infrastructure, be flexibility, be childcare support. Fourth, developing leadership for women. And five, last but not least, getting bias out of the system, which is basically changing men mindset. And when I say biased, it's in evaluation, in promotion. For me, one of the examples we still see, for example, just to explain what I mean with bias is when you are on a table and somebody is going to say, oh, but she has 4 kids, so we shouldn't propose that to her, she would never accept. Let her decide what she wants to do. Why would you have this type of remark around the table? So this is what I call a bias. It's assumption on things. You would never say that on a man saying he has 4 kids, he's not going to see what I mean. So these are the 5 things. So from the CEO to getting bias out of the system. And so on this one, there has been companies progressing, some other less progressing. Now, how does digital impact, which was a long circle to get to the impact of digital on women? I think there are forces going in both ways. Digital creates flexibility, or at least allows flexibility. So you can be active wherever you are. I think it helps women as well as men, but it helps getting more flexibility, fluidity in the system, thanks to digital. On the other hand, we need more people with STEM capabilities, science, technology, engineering, and math. And right now we have at most 20% women in STEM. I think it's between 15 and 20%, while it's a growing skill required for all the jobs or activities we talked about. So here we need to get more women. It's, I think everybody knows that 18 girls and boys are as good, but girls don't choose to go to STEM, or we need more STEM. So here we need to find a way. We are talking about finance also. Before all this, some mathematically based. So here, disadvantage today, but so the point is to how do we get more attractiveness of these courses, because digital will require more of that. And the last element I would highlight, which is a risk, is that in artificial intelligence, there is this question of, is AI reproducing the current bias? Since we are learning from existing data, or at least the neural networks are learning from existing data, if existing data includes a bias on the society, then we are going to reproduce in AI the bias of today. So here, it's more a risk to make sure at least it's addressed somewhere. So when I see that, there are, it's a few things to address to ensure we don't stop the progression we have seen and we get on an acceleration path and not a regression path.
Right, I guess there's a bit of irony here of two white men up here talking about diversity and gender in the AI transformation. But one of the things that you said that was really important is to be able to change men's mindsets, right? If we're in a system where there's inequality, right? But one of the other things that you were saying, right, is not just gender, but diversity. Right?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the benefits of diversity to organizations, right, we might, there are many dimensions beyond gender. Is that something that the Women Matter project has looked at, and what are your thoughts about that?
No, I think a couple of thoughts. We have been, when we have been interviewing and discussing, for the last research project, we talked to 20 leaders around the world, CEOs, the Prime Minister of Canada, Christine Lagarde at IMF. So, and obviously we always started with gender, but at the end we said, what is your dream for tomorrow? And the dream for tomorrow is an inclusive society and an inclusive company or organization. And inclusive is for everyone. So I think for me the important is how do we get, the 5 elements I mentioned, they apply to inclusion of everyone. How do we get the CEO? How do we get the mindset? How do we get the infrastructure for everyone? But so I think the implication is, obviously, woman is not an important element. Is a first step, but most of the program should evolve into more inclusive for everyone. And some companies have started that now. When they start getting progress on women, they accelerate, saying, "Look, this is starting. It's inclusion for everyone." And you have some, same thing. You have some topics to address that may be more specific, but the framework, I would say, of change, I think, is similar.
And I think when we're looking at some of the other dimensions that's in this nice quote here about diversity, we could think the elements that you're talking about, training, for example, I think you mentioned generational diversity, age diversity. If we are lucky enough to be able to have a long life, we'll probably experience being in a lower status age category. If we're lucky enough to have a long work life in work that we enjoy, right? We might are very likely to join groups, people with disabilities, for example. That's if we are older workers are disproportionately likely to join that category of people with disabilities in the workplace. And so there are many opportunities to engage in skills education for multiple categories, right? And if we're benefiting from diversity, then we can try to look for opportunities to benefit from diversity broadly. Right? Now, in terms of the opportunities that this creates, have there been surprises? I gave the example of the Phoenix as learning from kind of trying to take lessons from a disaster. Do you have examples of kind of, and I also gave the example of these highly digitized companies in Silicon Valley that are having very strong difficulties with issues of diversity and gender that they're encountering. So do we have some success stories that we can also try to learn from? We had Sweden at the country level. Do we have organizational lessons that you'd want to put forward?
I think on the for me on the organization, I would come back to just what I mentioned before in terms of the highly successful I would say organization. Frankly, they start from the customers. Seems obvious, but many companies who have digitized or transformed sometimes have started from the back office. Let me put robots on a process. That's okay. But if you start from a purpose, what is a purpose? And at the end of the day, everybody is trying to serve a customer. And so when you think about the transformation getting digital, it's really which is a classic strategy question, but how do I serve better my customers, and how do I get everyone to drive that? And so when you're able to do this and then transform the way to operate, so to get agile companies, these are the success stories. But usually you need a bold CEO, you need to get the best talent. So I would say all the great stories we have in business cases of great CEO, great story. But the learnings I take is this one on the transformation aspect. And from that, I think we have seen several companies in B2B or in B2C, by the way, or B2C and B2B. It's true also for industrial companies, starting to, how do you get customer experience better in the B2B is as important as in the B2C, for example. And in digital, customer experience is a big topic.
So starting with the customer,
test and learn.
Test and learn.
New skills, and agile organization.
Excellent.
That would be the four.
Excellent. Well, I think that's an excellent place to pause and transition, because I've had the opportunity and the privilege to be able to direct my questions and what I wanted to get your insights about. But one of the things we wanted to do and make sure is that we have the opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions. So we're going to transition to an open Q&A portion of the evening. We have 2 mics that are going around. This is being recorded and broadcast. So I'll ask for you to raise your hand if you have a question that you want to ask. Please think through your question so that you're asking a question, and Eric will be happy to do his best to answer it. But it'll be easier for him to answer if it comes in the form of a question, right? And please wait for the microphone to make its way to you and direct your question into the microphone. And we have our Q&A session. So please go ahead, raise your hand, and somebody will come to you with a microphone. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, evening, and thank you for that excellent and fascinating presentation, Monsieur Labaye and Professor Rubineau. Thank you, too. My question is related to the project that has to do with the youth unemployment and the turnaround that you were able to achieve. And I was just wondering if the results that you saw assumed that there was a level of literacy already amongst the youth that you were working with within those countries, because as you know, I'm sure youth unemployment has a lot to do with lack of literacy or low education levels. So I was just wondering if there was an assumption that there was already a level of literacy that allowed you at McKinsey to achieve the results that you saw.
Yeah, in that as we were working with 18-year-old with minimum literacy, yes, but no specific skills, very little, but at minimum on literacy side, yes. And then.
And you can raise your hands while somebody's asking, right? So the other person in the microphone can make their way to you.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Just a question. Thank you very much. This was fascinating. Thank you very much. I'd like to go back, and I know you used Phoenix, and unfortunately that wasn't a great example, but maybe you can expand on this transition and the role of governments. I know you talked about regulations and so on, but I would hope maybe you'd have examples of role models of, you talk about Sweden, or what is it that governments can do so that they somewhat can lead that transition?
For me, one of the best role models are the Nordic, at least from Europe, are Nordic countries. And then in America, it's Canada usually. So, and because most of the governments that have started reforming themselves toward performance are the ones that are ahead of the others. Now, to maybe deepen a bit the perspectives, I think the most important for governments, in fact, is to recognize what they can do and what they cannot do. Because if I go the other way of, what are the failures usually when governments believe they can do everything? They believe they create jobs, they believe they train everyone. And so the question is to find the right balance in terms of, where a government absolutely legitimate and where it can or it can be done by others. And so for me, that's the most important. And when I think about where government is the most legitimate, it's why I always back to regulation, because nobody is going to regulate except governments. So regulation, regulation, regulation. The second is, in fact, on research, because fundamental research usually is done by government. The risk is too high for private sectors to do fundamental research. So they are going to be, and so where you put the money of the fundamental research is going to lead to a lot of the new fields. So this is government. Number 3 on education is on courses and getting some visibility of the new skills of tomorrow. Not maybe identifying them or putting in place a process to identify, because I do believe more in a process that is going to get everyone to talk to define what the future would look like. I don't believe a ministry somewhere in Paris or Ottawa can define by itself, but it can put a process that is going to make everybody to define it. And number 4, back to the transition, is going to be around purchasing or where is the government going to buy new technologies? So autonomous cars, new software. So as a way of being the one launching the new technologies by being first at the frontier and maybe sometimes a guinea pig, but that's okay, to be the first one. So when I think about some of the elements that are helping in the transition, and obviously, maybe in regulation, I put obviously the labor, I would put everything. I put the sector regulation and the labor market regulation and social security we talked about before. But maybe to add 2 or 3 others to the one I mentioned. And with that, I think it can at least stimulate the action of others, universities, companies, NGOs, and etc.
And yeah, so please raise hands if you have a question. Oh, good.
No.
Good afternoon. I thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon, and you talked about what the future, in fact, will look like. But I work in design management, and when you look at the manufacturing process, one day it's only reasonable to think that the whole manufacturing process will become automated one day. Because the machines can produce faster. And now the banking industry is becoming automated. And also the retail now, people are going at the cashless now and going through and punching everything up on the debit card. So my question is, in relation to the look in the future and the relationship of how the human being will be left, some of the people that are not keeping up with the technology, and there will be virtually less jobs for humans, and especially some of the aged people. I go to some of the construction management projects, and a lot of the elderly people are being left behind because they're not keeping up with the BIM and the computer technology. And so I think that eventually, or unless other industries start to open up, that there is going to be less room for the human in some of the industries. This is how I feel if we're looking at the future in a broader scope. And this is very scary to me.
Yeah, but in industries, not in services. So Maybe I can use.
Yeah, but banking
Yeah.
is now becoming automated, and they're cutting banking hours at the count. Like I used to bank at Scotiabank in Laurentian. They're cutting hours, and retail now you have to go through the automated. You punch up the debit, so less people
Sure.
are being hired.
Yeah, and so maybe one element I didn't use, but let me use that to answer maybe your question, is you remember I mentioned what is going to be automated, and which is at the bottom, which is processing, what you mentioned, processing data, collecting data, this one automated. However, there are a few activities or skills where we still need human interaction. When you think about stores, you may have less people at the cash machine or cashiers, but you may have more people helping you in some high format stores to make choices. In the bank, it's the same. Somebody to open an account, you don't need. Now it's 15 minutes, it's automated. But somebody to help you make investment or help you with some advice, right now, you have limited amount of time. So we are going to see, I think, reinvestment from some of these industries into people more on the interaction, which is my second type of activity, interacting with stakeholders. So you need more people interacting with stakeholders, more people providing expertise, like the one I mentioned, expertise to give you some help and advice, and then also some in management, etc. So the question is going to be, are they going to be only in this industry? Because maybe at the end of the day, you may have less retailers, but you are going to have more in other industries. And that's my next chart. Yeah.
The net creation that might happen.
The net creation, and here you can see here, and we have different countries. Let's look at the left side, which are the developed countries. We have two charts. This is a chart with growth of jobs. Where are we going to find more jobs in the future than today? And so here, a lot back to also aging, care providers. In technology, you see a lot of job in technology. We are going then to get in management and so on. So this axis, this is where you get the growth. Obviously, on the next page, all the examples you gave are on this page with the yellow light or yellow color on the left side. When we are, in office support, in retail support, in all the operations are going to have less jobs. So the key question, obviously, is how do we ensure these jobs are created? It's back to my point before. How do we get these jobs created? Because it's clear we see these jobs disappearing. And so it's why it's important to go back to the activity level and see how can we enrich the customer satisfaction, the customer service, and to add basically the jobs that are on this chart that are going to be in some industries, in some maybe less in some others, but that's where the debate is. And right now, when we look at our median scenario, but again, it's a scenario, I don't have a crystal ball, but we see enough driving forces to see the creation of this type of employment and activities. You were talking about design, creativity. We see a lot of development around that. We see a lot of products now. Design was very focused before. Now, almost even in B2B, in industry, design is a big deal because customers, they want better products, etc. And so I'm sure today we have, in fact, far more designers tomorrow than today. So then, does it compensate the number of cashiers? Maybe not by itself, but it's the sum of all these things. So I think it's important to go at a level of granularity, activity by activity, and then to push for the skill development. Do we have enough school of design, for example, to get enough designer? It's like data scientists. In 2011, we identified a gap of more than 200,000 data scientists. There was not enough in the school system to get these data scientists. Now it's coming. I know it's even coming here. But the sooner you get also the production of skills, I think it's as usual, supply and demand. When you have skills available, you get the jobs up. So
we have time for one last question. So I think somebody has the mic already. We have the class rules, right? The one. Thank you.
Again, thank you for an excellent presentation. I would ask you to make some comments about the characteristics of transformation between different political types. In other words, communist versus democrat democracies. Are there specific factors that you've seen between different polities that will hinder or not?
So China versus the West, who's going to win? I think we can have an entire discussion on that. Can you answer that in 1 minute?
No, I'm not sure. I think it's better at cocktail to discuss that, but because we don't do policy, I would say, recommendation. We looked at things. What I may say is I would have two. Maybe I could make just one comment from a fact, which is, at least in Europe and even most of the transformation have been driven by social democrats. You look at Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, etc. We would say the counter-argument is the UK under Mrs. Thatcher, but the fundamental transformation usually have been driven. Again, it may be the combination of just the type of things that need to happen, the fact they can align the stakeholders to make things happen. And so, again, it's not a question of political direction, it's more a question of the environment make this type of transformation happen. And in my mind, the reason is because they can align stakeholders to make the fundamental transformation from old world to new world.
Nice. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to, on behalf of Desautels Faculty of Management, McGill University, I'd like to give Mr. Labaye.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming out, and thank you for donating some of the cocktail time to this Q&A session. But now we can ask questions one-on-one and continue the discussion in cocktails. So please join us for some refreshments in the other room. Thank you very much.